We are just arriving to the last but not least lecturer, Mr. Dániel Gazsó from Hungary. Dániel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, my name is Dániel Gazsó, and I'm coming from one of the organizing institute of this event, namely the Research Institute for Hungarian Communities Abroad. So I would like to say, firstly, thank you for all panelists for coming. I'm very glad that this event could take place here, giving the opportunity to share knowledge and experiences on a so specific issue as the diaspora policies is, between so many experts from different countries. I also consider very important that not only people from the scientific area are present here, but also people who are part of the decision-making bodies of diaspora policies, because under these circumstances, I think this event could be an excellent opportunity for exchanging analytical perspectives with pragmatic approaches to the relationship between kin state and diaspora. So many panelists have talked about Hungarian diaspora policies. So in my presentation, I want to focus on the special practices that Hungary manage toward the diaspora. But I would like to give you a general overview of diaspora studies, especially as it relates to diaspora policies, with an emphasis on the emerging kin state activism in Central and Eastern Europe. First of all, looking toward useful methodological approaches to diaspora policies, I think that we can take as a starting point Alan Gamlen's typology of diaspora and judgment practices. Gamlen reviewed the diaspora policies of approximately 70 states in order to facilitate comparative studies in this field. And as the result of this research, he identified three general types of diaspora policies. Firstly, the capacity building policies that we have mentioned in the first panel, which refers to the symbolic nation building policies as well as to the institution building policies. Secondly, he spoke about the extensions of rights, which was the main issue of your presentation, because it includes the extension of voting rights as well, and the ethnic preferential naturalization too. And thirdly, the policies on extracting obligations from the diaspora, which include the classic lobby promotion, but also the investment policies, the so-called remittances policies. Of course, the three types of diaspora policy in real life cannot be as sharply separated as in theory. The same diaspora-focused program or project can adjust to different types of diaspora policy. It could fit the symbolic nation-building policies as well as institutions-building policies, but it could also be interpreted as a project of extending rights or extracting obligations. However, Gamlen's typology helps us to understand structurally the relationship between kin state and host state. Another starting point in this field of study could be Roger Brubecker's well-known triadic nexus, which mainly consists of the interrelationship between kin state, kin minorities, and host state. The three-element model that Brubaker developed primarily for the study of the national question related to the autochthonous kin minorities in Eastern and Southern Europe also can be applied in the field of diaspora studies, but it should be augmented with at least two additional elements. On the one hand, in addition to the diaspora communities, their host states and kin states, we should take into account the controlling and regulating role of international organizations such as NATO and the EU. Many scholars have argued the importance of them since the first publication of Brubecker's triadic nexus. And on the other hand, we also need to consider the already mentioned autochthonous kin minorities formed as a result of border changes and diaspora communities of migratory origin to be two separate political fields. Their separation is justified by the different nature of their institutional forms, by their relations with the kin state on the one hand and with the host state on the other, and also by the interplay between their organizations. I think that is the point that we haven't mentioned already today. A good example of this relationship is when the diaspora support autochthonous co-nationals living beyond the borders of their kin states, such as the Hungarian diaspora have supported many times the Hungarian minorities living in the Carpathian Basin. The Hungarian Human Rights Foundation is worth to mention here, because this diaspora organization, which was founded in New York City almost 50 years ago, was founded with the aim to support and protect the rights of the Hungarians living in Czechoslovakia and Romania. Here I can also mention the great financial support that the Hungarians living in Transcarpathia, Western Ukraine, have received in the recent decades from the Hungarian diaspora in Western Europe and overseas. So this relationship could be as a fifth element of the model. So with all this in mind, I consider very useful to study the political dimensions of the diaspora through this five-element model, which consists of Brubaker's triadic nexus augmented by the regulating roles and of the international organizations and the interplay in relationship between autochthonous and allochthonous co-national communities living abroad. Now turning to the study of particular diaspora policies, the sociopolitical context as well as the historical background are also very important. Although there are some seemingly similar kin-state policies adopted in different parts of the world, such as the so-called ethnic preferential naturalization, they cannot be considered under the same category. Indeed, dual citizenship that we have mentioned several times today does not mean the same in Eastern Europe or even in Southern Europe, as it does in the Western world, where the term citizenship is often used interchangeably with the term nationality. Regarding Central and Eastern Europe, one of the first things we need to consider is that almost all diaspora engagement practices targeted toward the diaspora communities of migratory origin are closely related to the national question. That is the question of the proper relation between the territorial border of the state and the imagined limits of the nation. After the political changeovers from 1989 to 1991, in most of the countries of this region, recovering from socialism and moving towards democracy, the national question, in addition to the idea of Europeanization, became again a central issue in political life. The main and most pressing issue in this regard was about how to fulfill the kin state's responsibility. Initially, successive governments sought to fulfill it with the support of the so-called autochthonous kin minorities formed by border changes during the 20th century, firstly after the First World War, through the disintegration of the great multinational and heterogeneous empires of the Ottomans, Habsburgs and Romanovs, and the creation of new states. And secondly, due to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia following the end of the Cold War. So diaspora policies in this part of Europe, as Myra Waterbury mentioned as well, which have become increasingly important since the turn of the millennium, should be interpreted as an extension of the classical Eastern European kin state policy towards autochthonous kin minorities living mostly in neighboring countries. Due to the historical, political and cultural peculiarities that determine the conditions of the region, the diaspora engagement practices of different Central and Eastern European kin states indeed show some similarities, especially at the level of legislation. Almost all countries in this region, in addition to the constitutional assumption of kin states' responsibility, have adopted benefit laws, which usually guarantee benefits equally for all co-nationals abroad. regardless of the foreign country in which they live. The Polish and the Hungarian legislation are exceptional because their benefit laws concern benefits with territorial restrictions, giving preference to the autochthonous minorities in the neighboring countries. The other common adopted diaspora policy at the level of legislation is the ethnic preferential naturalization with full or restricted citizenship rights. Apart from these legislative practices, there are many forums, projects and programs supported by the state with the aim of fostering homeland affiliation, for example, by birthright programs in which I think Israel is a pioneer, as it was mentioned, or with the aim of supporting the cultural, linguistic and religious heritage, or promoting national identity of the diaspora. Regarding the latter, we can take the Körösi Csoma Sándor program, which was also mentioned by Maria Waterbury and the State Secretariat. This program was launched in 2013 as the first large-scale initiative that personally addressed to Hungarians living in diaspora. It mainly consists of sending every year around 100 interns from Hungary to specific Hungarian diaspora organizations with the aim of furthering their community work in various countries throughout the world. These diaspora engagement practices are based on the idea of deterritorialized nationhood through transborder membership. And this is very important because that is the reason why they are so popular. They are popular because they constitute an easy solution to the national question, incorporating co-nationals into the nation's political community, but without directly questioning the current borders of the state. It doesn't mean that these seemingly non-conflicting resolutions cannot cause political contingencies within the countries, I mean among political elites, as well as between countries, among the kin states and the host states, governments, for example. The five-element model that I exposed before actually serves to understand this kind of conflicts generated on the base of diaspora policies. It is also important that diasporas used to provide support toward their kin state too, which I also mentioned at the beginning of my speech and which was one of the main issues of the presentation about Israel diaspora policies. Diaspora can support their external national homeland by political lobbying as well as by economic assistance. And according to World Bank projections, in the mid-2010s, people living in diaspora were expected to remit almost $600 billion in earnings. In 27 countries at that moment, remittances were equal to more than 10% of GDP, and in 10 countries, they were equal to more than 20% of GDP. Therefore, the relationship between kin state and diaspora is not unidirectional. That we have to consider a very important point when we are analyzing specific cases. Concluding my speech, I also wish to note that the complex and multidirectional relationship between kin state and diaspora is not constant, but instead constantly changing. A rearrangement of geopolitical relations, an economic crisis, a change of government, or even a pandemic can all result in a complete strategic change of direction in this area. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And now it's time for questions and answers for all attendants.
If I understand correctly, the majority of the diaspora, or the large chunk anyways, is in Germany, right?
Yes, half.
Yeah. So what is your relationship with other institutions? Not of only, I wouldn't necessarily, I'm not asking about the relationship with the Turkish organizations there, of Turkish diaspora, but with the Germans in general. How do you collaborate with the Germans on that question? So for example, we have GIZ in our country where we kind of collaborate, but this is very, I'm from Serbia, by the way, sorry, I didn't My name is Ivan. I'm director of Returning Point, which is an organization that helps people repatriate and also promote circular migration, and I'm advisor to the Prime Minister in the cases of diaspora, depopulation, and digital nomads. And so my question is, how do you collaborate with the Germans on more like an institutional level?
That's not an easy question to answer, but actually, the understanding of the diaspora policies among the states in the world should be, open and come to a level that we should understand each other. At the moment, almost more than half of the UN member countries have diaspora organization, diaspora politics, diaspora policies, either ministry or any institution and agency. But when it comes to question of to integrate or to engage or to work together, most of the countries are hesitating to coordinate or to work with the diaspora agency of the government of the country, their citizens living in his own country. With the Germany, I was born in Germany as well. My father was guest worker in Germany, in Berlin. I'll just give you an example. In one of the meetings I had with the Director General in the Federal Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Berlin, I just told him, look, I know the history of the German diaspora. It's a huge couple of 100 years of the diaspora policies. And yes, there is some issue with the diaspora policies of Germany, particularly before the Second World War, but just put in that case. And Germany is the country now spending a couple of billion euros for the diaspora through different institutions, not just one institution. And what you are doing for your diaspora and what you are expecting for your diaspora, we are doing and expecting the same thing for Turkish diaspora living in Germany. The answer was, we don't have diaspora policy, we just have consular work, consular services. This is not right, we know. And there was a diaspora ministerial conference organized by ILO 4 or 5 years ago in Geneva. And they're going to organize a new one this year, the Diaspora Ministerial Conference. I think this is good venue to be discussed by the government. There is a diaspora policies everyone knows, each countries, but at the same time, they don't want to discuss this openly in international, to regulate this. There should be regulation if you want to continue peacefully with among ourselves, because everyone has, the territorial system does not contain all the nations. And in this globalized world, no chance to contain all the nations within the territory. So there's multiple, the understanding, and that should be improved. Thank you.
Okay.
Just like there was this one even example of a tax advisor that was he's one of the leading global tax lawyers. He's Serbian, and he was basically in this one conversation that we had. It was more like a public conversation saying that there should be a movement trying to say that all the countries, the recipients of diaspora, should be giving a portion of the tax that they collect from.
Like Eritrea.
Yeah, back to the
Eritrea
country if they want. Yeah, so let's say the Turks go into Germany, as long as they're Turkish citizens and not German citizens, that a portion of the tax they collect from the Turkish citizens should be sent back to Turkey.
That's interesting.
Interesting concept. It would be. I don't know how the countries that are recipients of immigration would accept that, but
just
open up a conversation.
Yeah, to be honest, we all have minorities or the diasporas of other nations within our borders. In Serbia, in Turkey, in Hungary, in Germany, in Africa. At the same time, we all have our diasporas outside our borders. We do not have same policies, similar approach to both these group of people. So this is why we need to be open on more human way of dealing with this issue. We have, unfortunately, completely different policies towards the minorities, incoming, migration, but what we are expecting from other countries to treat our immigrants is completely different. That's unfortunate, and we need to work on that one.
Yes, thank you. First, a quick question for Nadav. I was just wondering, is your organization unique in that? I guess I'm trying to figure out, are there other groups that are trying to do similar things, for example, for Israeli, artists and creative workers and things like that, or is there a particular focus on the science angle? Because it seems like that might be another interesting point. And then I guess a quick question for our Turkish colleagues, hopefully quick. So if I understood your timeline correctly, the initial legislative change that would allow for external voting happens in 2008, is that correct? And then you roll out a plan 2009 to 2010, and then you come up against these bureaucratic barriers until 2014, which is the first time. I guess I was just curious if there were other significant barriers other than this very sort of practical, bureaucratic, this is hard and we don't quite know how to do it issue, or if there was, kind of what was the sort of, were there other kind of political or more ambiguous or fuzzy arguments against the implementation? Anyway, thank you.
So about the uniqueness of the organization, we are the only one in Israel that do that really fighting the brain drain. This is not the right phrase to use in Israel, but this is the phrase that everyone knows. The uniqueness of the organization, that when he was established in 2006, he was called Bio Abroad, and it was changed somewhere 5 years ago to Science Abroad. We really changed it in order to give the opportunities even to people that did their PhD in art, or in math, or in political science, or in history, and we offer them their special communities in those fields. But I think that the state of Israel, as it said before, there is the Diaspora special official that deal with that and try to help artists and those people to move back to Israel as well. But we are dealing specifically with PhDs with all fields.
The first amendment after the changes of the Constitution in 1995, that was a constitutional change, which removed the barriers. There wasn't barriers, but perceived barrier. And the legislative change to adopt, implementation occurred in 2008. In that changes, no political parties opposed to the change, except one party, which is the predecessor of the HDP. They opposed because of the in the overseas electoral system, you don't give the right to be voted for the independent candidates. They were at the same time running as independent. So that was their second issue. They opposed because of the local elections. They want to, in none of the practices in the world, including local, because in the election system, voting system, citizenship is linked mostly with the national elections, and with the local elections, most countries linked with the residential status. This is the general trend. So there was none opposition. But in 2010 and 11, we couldn't have this chance to implement because of first, mostly is the technical and bureaucratic things, lack of preparation. We know how the bureaucracies work, is, wait until the last minute. And there were some issues from the countries who are hosting, majority of the diaspora. In one of the official visits, we had this discussion with different countries in Europe, but mostly were ready to accept. And it wasn't like when the first implementers of this electoral voting system like France, Italy, Portuguese had experience in 1970s. French had big issue with the Swiss government in 1970s. Swiss government said, look, you cannot treat our borders, territory as your constituency. That was their constituency. Or Canada is still same. Yeah, but they didn't allow them. That this was the case in 1970s and 80s. In 2000s, that wasn't the case, almost. Germany only said they were kind of concerned about the security issues, if we had any security issues. That's why they only allowed in 2014 to establish ballot boxes in 7 spots. Then they allowed to establish in 13 consulates. In 2012, when we had another amendment, that when we worked at that time, what I realized, they were, even though my colleagues, some of them didn't have diaspora experience. And so there were some technical and logistical problem with the legislation. In our organization, or diaspora agency, YTB, had a lot of staff with the diaspora background, even myself, as I said, we lived in diaspora. So that experience came into the work, and the changes into 2012 made this also, and the follow-up of the diaspora agency and the changes made it possible. But at the same time, we had some changes, amendments throughout the way. We had some 2015. Once we organized in 2014, we experienced some issues. We realized, and we had legislative changes, amendments. Secondary or the primary legislation. There are 3 types of legislation, primary and secondary, and secondary mostly. Along the way, we had some changes as well to make this more applicable to the diaspora's needs and experience. For example, one issue, we had this change in 2017. The diasporas can only used to vote for in the consulate that they are registered. We changed that one in 2017. That had some impact to increase 10% of the voting turnover, because some people, yes, registered, for example, in Frankfurt, but coming from Kassel to Frankfurt is 200 kilometers. But they can go to other countries or another consulate. We had this in Freiburg. Instead of traveling to Karlsruhe, you can go to Basel or Bregenz. We had these issues, these small amendments that made the turnover is more by the Turkish diaspora. Thank you.
Well, fortunately, we have another day tomorrow to continue our discussions. So this is the reason. It's not closing remarks, but as the request of the police and the National Guard, because the President of the Republic will arrive within 15 minutes. Thank you very much for this day, and thank you.